As you may have noticed, even when developing a small and simple Android application, it can be quite difficult to get the data to synchronize to the screen correctly in all cases. It takes quite a bit of code to set up the adapters to make sure that everything is updated, etc. Imagine what happens when you were to create a very large Android application with tens or maybe even hundreds of developers working to create a very large application with many user interfaces, many data types that all need to synchronize with the server. Um, that would be quite hard to manage. And as it used to be, Android doesn't offer a lot of guidance on how to do that. So the large developer shops, they set up their own procedures, created their own libraries to create an architecture for creating large-scale apps for the Android platform. Quite recently, in 2017 and later on building on that in 2018, Google released a set of components, the architecture components, and an architectural guide to developing these large-scale Android applications. And that's called the Android architecture components. And they're now shipped as part of Jetpack. Let's look at the common architectural principles. There are only two, so this is quite easy to understand. We won't be diving in too deep, but we can understand this. The first of all is separation of concerns, which is always a good idea. So that's separating model logic from the views and trying to separate storage from that, etc. The other one is derive the UI from a model. So that means that a model, the data model, is actually leading, and the user interfaces that show that data should be sort of automatically derived from the data. That's how we start. So how is it actually set up? This diagram gives us some insight. So we know this part, we know activities. If you don't know fragments, fragments are a way of splitting an activity up into multiple self-contained parts. But let's just look at activities for now. In this model, activities don't directly interact with the data model, which is over here at the other side of the model of this diagram. Instead, they interact with a view model, and a view model is similar to a model. It is in the way that it's observable and it contains the data. Only this data is especially fit for showing within a specific activity. So usually each specific activity or fragment has its own view model that has all the data tailored specifically for this activity. The view model itself doesn't contain the actual data. It contains it, but it's just a copy. The original data it gets through the repository. And the repository is an extra step, and it's an abstraction for whichever contains the authoritative storage for the data, which can be a model which eventually maps to a database, but it can also be remote data, so a network or some such. And often it's actually a combination. So the first time some piece of information is requested, the repository looks it up in the remote data source, and then it stores it within the database for a cache. And the next time the view model wants to know the same data, it can immediately get it from the database. And maybe in the background, it can do a check to see if it's still up to date with the web service over here. So that's the kind of thing the repository is responsible for, making sure these two sources are in some sort of sync. When we look below that to the left, this is where we see the database on the bottom. Android comes with SQLite built into it, so that's a logical choice for a data store. But in between there is the model, and the model is basically just your Java classes or your Kotlin classes that model the real world objects, such as a user and a thing, whatever your application is about. But the Room thing over here, this is the object relation manager that Android introduced with the Android architectural components. An ORM is like well, in the Python and Flask universe, we also know an ORM which is called SQL Alchemy, and Room is similar to that in many ways. Though if you look into the details, it is quite a bit different. Well, this model has been quite well received by the Android building community. It is quite complex. When you're building an application that's not all that large, it feels like many steps to have to create a view model and then to have to create a repository in order to finally interact with the actual model objects. So while this is a very useful model for large-scale app development, for beginners and for small-scale app development, it can be a bit tedious and a bit overwhelming. So that's why in the rest of this course we will not be looking at the view model and we won't be looking at the repository. Instead, we'll have the activity directly interact with a Room model and directly interact with the network. But do keep in mind that once your application starts growing and you want to dive into Android development a bit further, then the view model and the repository are actually things you will want to look at.